Welcome to Sickcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining us today on the Sikh-Cast. Today we're joined by Santbir Singh, who is a research associate at the Sikh Research Institute and is pursuing his PhD in sociology at York University. In this episode, we'll be embarking on a journey through Santbir Singh's article, The Attack on Political Sikhi, which you can find the whole article on sikhi.org. This article delves into why the 1984 June attack and the November pogroms happened. Although Sikhs make up a small percentage of India's population, they have had a large political presence since even before independence from the British in 1947. This highlights the vast political capacity of the Sikhs. So today we'll explore how the government's target in 1984 was the destruction of this political capacity. Thank you, Santbir Ji, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. It's really nice to be talking to you again, Manvinder.
Yes. Let's just hop right into it. In this article, you take some time to argue that although Sikhs know what happened in 1984, so they know about the events, there's maybe less knowledge about why these incidents occur. So what do you think people assume is the why for why these events occurred, and why don't people know about the maybe actual reason?
I think history can sometimes get complicated and we can simplify narratives in our mind. I think a lot of people assume that it's something like, India doesn't like Sikhs and that's why we were attacked, or Indira Gandhi personally had it out for Sikhs and that's why we were attacked. And it's sort of these simplified narratives, which aren't that far off the mark, to be honest, but they lose a lot of the real details of the event and fail to put into place all of the socio-political reasons why events like this happened. You know, since partition, 84 is really the most important event in Sikh history in the last 100 years. And it's had a tremendous impact on all aspects of Sikhi, both within Punjab and the diaspora. And so to understand why this event occurred, what the reasons behind it were, how far back that actually stretches, I think that's really important. And I think it allows Sikhs to really put a broader understanding of what's going on in South Asia, what's going on in India, and what's going on with Sikhs today. We know with the farmers' protests and so on and so forth that there's still a lot of political upheaval in Punjab. And to understand the roots of that, you have to understand the roots of 84. Yeah.
I think we can work from pre-1947 all the way to the contemporary context in our conversation today. So yeah, maybe let's start with what was the backdrop against which the events of 1984 occurred. So what was happening before 1984? Maybe what was setting the stage for these events to occur?
We could be talking for hours and hours about that. The late 70s and early 80s were a time of a lot of political and social turmoil in Punjab. The Green Revolution had happened. There was a lot of economic upheaval in Punjab. There was a lot of social issues that were starting to be noticeable for the first time, issues that are still quite prominent in Punjab today, like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, rampant unemployment, issues like domestic violence, sexual assault. All of these issues really started to come to the fore in the late 70s. At the same time, this is post 1966, so Sikhs had gotten a Punjabi Suba, Punjabi state. Sikhs were a majority in the state, but the Punjabi Suba that had been achieved in 1966 was not completely what Sikhs had been asking for. There were some real issues with it. And that leads directly into 84. So the main issues were things like access to water rights, which is still an ongoing problem in Punjab, as we well know, um, and other socioeconomic demands. And all of these different demands that the Sikhs had was encapsulated in a document called the Anandpur Sahib Resolution, which had been approved by the Shromani Akali Dal, the main Sikh political party, in 1978 as the principle by which they would be struggling for in the future. Like that would be their main political campaign, would be the implementation of the Anandpur Sahib Resolution. So there's these political demands happening, there's a social upheaval happening, there's economic upheaval, and at the same time, there's a lot more violence occurring against Sikhs at the time as well. So you have the 1978 Amritsar massacre, where 13 Sikhs are killed from the Akhand Kirtani Jatha and the Dandami Taksal. You have in the wake of the Amritsar massacre of 78, another massacre happening in Kanpur in 79, and a lot of violence starting to happen, where we see for the first time a pattern that would emerge much stronger, unfortunately, in the late 80s and early 90s, which is disappearances and forced extrajudicial killings start to happen. At the same time, the Congress Party, Indira Gandhi's party, were really desperate to stay in power. And part of her campaign to stay in power was to demonize Sikhs. And this demonization of a minority group within the country is an old pattern that we've seen in lots of countries before. It's sort of a tried and true um, methodology for tyrants to stay in power, is to ostracize and scapegoat a certain community. And so there's increasing violence against Sikhs, there's increasing discrimination against Sikhs, there's social and economic and political upheaval, there's political demands. All these things are leading up into 84. And so it's a really complex series of events. I hope that the article lays it out in a more straightforward way, but that's pretty much what's happening leading up to 84. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, if folks want more context, if they want, yeah, like more of a deep dive, they can access the article, which is called Attack on Political Sikhi. You also do a great job in the article of talking about like the character of Indira Gandhi. Yeah, if you could spend some time talking about that, I think that also could be helpful for people who are listening.
So Indira Gandhi is an interesting character. She's really lauded in the West. I remember a few years ago, there was a children's book about strong women from history, and she had been included in that list until Sikhs had protested against this children's book publisher, who really had no idea and weren't doing it maliciously, but just thought, oh, wow, this is so inspiring. A female prime minister of a country that's not known for being very progressive on gender issues. So people have this sort of idea in the West of what Indira Gandhi was, but the reality of Indira Gandhi is very different. Um, and to understand Indira Gandhi, you have to first understand the fact that she was really groomed for power. Her father was the Prime Minister of India, the founding Prime Minister of India. Her grandfather was one of the leading leaders of the Congress Party before independence and partition. And so she was raised in the seat of power, and it was assumed that when her father died, she would become prime minister. So it's very much like this succession, not a very democratic system, not a very not a meritocracy at all. It's just assumed that Indira Gandhi is going to become the leader because she's Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter, right? At the same time, once Indira comes into power, she really changes certain things about what the Congress Party represented and how it behaved. Now, the Congress Party always had an issue with wanting a very strong central government, which had led to a lot of conflict with Sikhs, especially because we wanted more rights for individual states and regions to have protection over their language and culture and religion and so on and so forth. But Nehru had been really focused on trying to build a secular state and trying to develop a country based on very socialist ideals to some degree. Whereas Gandhi wasn't as economically ideological, but she was more interested in staying in power. And that was her main goal and main focus. And in 1975, she was found guilty of an abuse of power, and she was told to vacate her seat in the House of Commons, or what they call the Lok Sabha in India, and to go to jail, in fact, for having cheated in the last election prior to 1975. And instead of obeying the wishes of the Supreme Court and following the rule of law, Indira Gandhi declares a national emergency and suspends the constitution, gets rid of all civil liberties and civil rights, and essentially becomes a dictator within the country for the next 2.5 years. So that's really the background of the type of person Indira Gandhi was. She was someone who would essentially break the country's democratic tradition, break the country's, um, um, it's still only like a 30-year-old country at that point, but really destroy all of its political traditions just in a quest to stay in power. And she's someone who would go after her enemies pretty ruthlessly, which she did during the emergency. And the emergency is important to understand because Sikhs were one of the groups that, or perhaps the only social religious group that protested against the emergency en masse in huge numbers. And Sikhs went to jail in huge numbers to protest emergency. I think 40% of the people arrested during emergency were Sikhs. So this incredible outpouring of fighting for democracy and fighting for rights really irked Indira Gandhi. And I think there was a sense of a personal nature to her dislike of Sikhs because of what happened during emergency. But it also just went really easily with her larger campaign of like, let's demonize Sikhs, let's say that they're agents of Pakistan, and we can create a situation where the Hindu heartland will vote for me and I will stay in power. And so she was someone who was willing to do that and to go after a minority group to stay in power.
Hmm. So, kind of coming back to something you had shared, now that we have like the political context, we have the social, the economic, we have the local, we have the national context for the events leading up to 1984, you had mentioned something called the Anandpur Sahib Resolution. Yeah, can you share a little bit more about what this document contained, what it called for, who it was written by, and who it was for?
Yeah, so the Anandpur Sahib Resolution was this document by the Shromani Akali Dal, and it was written by one of the sort of greatest Sikh scholars of the 20th century, a man by the name of Sardar Kapoor Singh. For those of you who have studied Sikh theology and history, you've probably read something of his in the past. And we use his writings, for example, in Sikhi 201 in our course at Siddiq. So Sardar Kapoor Singh wrote the Anandpur Sahib Resolution, and it's really a beautifully written document because it was written by Sardar Kapoor Singh. And the demands in it, it's thought of as this really radical document that was advocating for a separate Sikh state, and something that Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale had fought for. So it must be this incredibly controversial thing. But if you actually look at the document, it's not advocating for a separate Sikh homeland at all. It's asking for Sikh rights within the structure of the Indian government, within the structure of the Indian state. And its demands are pretty pedestrian by the standards of political demands that you might see from a minority group. It's asking for protection for language, protection for religion, protection for culture. It's asking for simple things like setting up a broadcasting radio out of Harmandir Sahib, which now that we have video recordings of Harimandar Sahib, going out live all over the world, seems like a pretty small ask. But at that time, the Indian government was refusing to let a radio broadcast leave from Harimandar Sahib. And then it had larger economic demands, which were really progressive and quite inspirational. So talking about things like um, providing economic benefits to so-called low-caste people, to women, to minorities, and not. This isn't just for Punjab. This is for people around India. So to provide free farm equipment to low-caste farmers, to provide interest-free loans to low-caste businessmen, and so on and so forth, to economically uplift people in the country, and to really help create a more egalitarian society. So it had those economic demands, it had some religious demands, it had some Punjab specific demands as well, like Punjabi water rights and Punjab getting its capital back, which was a big point of contention because Chandigarh had been made as a capital for Punjab after Lahore had been lost in partition. And then after Punjab was itself partitioned in 1966 to make Punjabi Suba, Chandigarh had been taken away from Punjab and created into a national capital, national, I forgot what the term they used, but it's essentially directly controlled by the federal government, not by the Punjab government, and it's a joint capital of Punjab and Haryana. And so this was really a sticking point to Sikhs that like our capital had been taken away and it's not under our control. So it had political demands like that. But I really have to emphasize it was nothing too revolutionary. And when people like read the Not Prasad resolution, you're like, oh, this is what Sant Jarnail Singh was fighting for. This is what Sikhs were fighting for leading up to 84. Like, this is not a radical document. This is like a progressive, economically forward looking, religiously inclusive document that's really trying to set up a new way for the Indian system to operate, and one that respects much more the fact that India is not a monoculture, not one religion, one people, one culture, one language, but is in fact made up of many peoples and many cultures and languages and traditions, and to respect that part of the South Asian context. Yeah.
Yeah, really working to like flatten out the Indian identity by making it fit into this discourse of one, like one nation, one language, etc.
Yes, which we see really prominent now with Hindutva. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you can kind of see its roots being formed. Not its roots, but you can see some of it, the discourse, like even starting then or continuing at that point. Yeah, so what stood out to me also was the ideological and epistemological violence that you talk about. And I feel like those are really like academic terms, and people get lost in the terminology and what they mean. So maybe we can start with what those two words mean and then how those violences occurred in this particular context.
Yeah. So when I'm talking about epistemological or ideological violence, I'm talking about violence not of the physical nature, but violence against the ideas that Sikhi represents or the traditions that Sikhi represents. And those ideas are things like an egalitarian society, a progressive society, one in which people are included, one in which there aren't um, distinctions made based on gender or caste, one in which the tradition of Miri Piri is really captured and put forward. This idea that Sikhs are sovereign in all spaces, in social political spaces as well as spiritual spaces. So the ideological or epistemological violence that's happening is that the Indian government is trying to undermine these central Sikh principles. They're trying to attack these central Sikh principles. So the attack in 84 was a very physical attack, a very brutal attack in which thousands of people were killed, in which thousands of people were assaulted, and just horrible things happened. But it's part of a larger campaign to undermine what I call political Sikhi. And even using the term political Sikhi is a little bit of a misnomer, and I point to that in the article because all Sikhi is political, to be honest. And that's really the heart of the issue, is that Sikhi is political. Sikhi is a faith tradition that doesn't see a distinction between the political and the social, between the political and the spiritual. And so an attack on political Sikhi is just simply an attack on Sikhi at its core. The idea that Sikhs should not be involved in political spaces, we should not be politically active, We should not be organizing as a community. We should not be advocating for our rights in certain ways. And that's really the heart of, I believe, what happened in 84. Sikhs were and remain actually today an incredibly potent political force and a community that is able to organize on a scale that very few communities in India are able to do. In fact, I don't think any other community in India is able to organize at that level that Sikhs have been able to. Considering that we're less than 2% of the population, our political significance in the Indian context has been really outsized. In independence, we've all heard the stats. How many Sikhs were involved in the independence struggle? How many Sikhs were arrested? How many Sikhs were executed by the British? It's really incredible, right? And post-independence, post-partition, we see Sikhs also organizing in huge numbers for Punjabi Suba to get a Punjabi-speaking state during emergency against Indira Gandhi's dictatorial policies. So Sikhs really organized in these huge campaigns to get political action achieved, to get political aims achieved. And that really, really disturbs the monolith of central Indian government. This idea that uh, everyone needs to follow the national line. No one should be too critical of the country. Everyone needs to be patriotic. No one should be compromising, talking about their own rights too much. All of those sort of big ideas that India is based on, Sikhs kept undermining that with our political activism again and again. And that's what the Indian government wanted to destroy. That's what the Indian government wanted to undermine. And that's what I mean by epistemological violence, was this idea of political Sikhi, of like, let's be involved, let's try to change the world, let's try to be socially and politically active, and let's not just try, let's actually do it. Let's organize as a community in huge numbers and do it. That's what the Indian government wanted to stop. And so when we talk about a genocide, there's different types of genocides that happen. And the 1984 does represent a genocide, but it's not like a genocide where everyone who was even 1/16th Sikh was rounded up and put into a concentration camp and executed, like what happened to the Roma or European Jewish people in World War II. That's not the type of genocide that Sikhs underwent. But Sikhs did undergo a cultural and political genocide where our traditions were under assault, our values were under assault, and the targeting of leadership and people within the community who were politically active was a way to try to undermine the community's political power and strength. And the 80s were unfortunately very horrifically successful at that. If you look at Punjab politics even today, there's a whole generation missing in that political um, uh, milieu, because a whole generation of leaders, of women and men in Punjab who were politically active, were wiped out by the government in the 80s and 90s. And their voices are missing um, from the Punjab political scene. So that's what I mean by this epistemological violence. It goes hand in hand with the physical violence, and both of them work together to try to undermine what I call political Sikhi, or just Sikhi in general. Yeah.
And I think everything you're talking about here, the political Sikhi, the Sikhi on its own, which is inherently political, the Miri Piri, is also speaking to the Sikh psyche that you also reference. Is there anything else maybe that you want to add about the Sikh psyche? Because it is brought up in the article. Like, what is the Sikh psyche, and how did it, yeah, come to be as it is? I know that's also a loaded question, but maybe for the context that we're talking about, we could focus on that.
Yeah, for sure. So the Sikh psyche really originates with Guru Nanak Sahib Ji. And it's this idea of Miri Piri, and this idea of like, you're a person in the world who can have an impact in the world, and your goal as a human being is not just spiritual liberation, it's not just for your own needs, it's to really make the society around you into a better place. And better means something very literal, which is a more equitable, egalitarian society where people are not exploited, where people are cared for and protected, where those who have lesser means are assisted and pushed forward, and where political leadership and social leadership is not something that's um, concentrated in a minority, but is instead sort of spread throughout the community in this really radical way. And that's what the Sikh psyche is. The Sikh psyche is this idea of like, we are going to change the world, and we're going to do it to make the world into a more equitable place, to really represent the core principles of what Ikko really stands for. And what Ikko really stands for is this idea that the divine is within all things equally. And can we make that vision of Ikko into a social reality, into a political reality? And all of Sikh history has sort of been a struggle to try to bring that vision of Ikko into the social realm, into the political realm. And that's that's what came up, that's what butted heads, that's what sort of came up with against into conflict with the Indian state. Because Sikhs, and I talk about this in the article, Sikhs consider themselves and always will as a Niara Pant, as a unique community. Um, and Pant is a hard word to translate, and sometimes we translate it as nation, and nation works, you know. But it's not exactly nation, it's not exactly community, it's not exactly people, it's that and more and different. And it's a uniquely Sikh term. But what it means is that the Sikh, let's just say the Sikh people, uh, um, that the Spant is always sovereign, regardless of the context, that it's sovereign even under British colonialism, that it's sovereign even when Ajit Singh is ruling, and that it's sovereign when we're living under the Indian state. And that is something that the Indian government could not abide by. They could not handle the fact that Sikhs still consider themselves to be a sovereign people, a sovereign state, a sovereign community, that is not necessarily, whose allegiance is not to the Indian government first and foremost, but its first and foremost allegiance is to Guru Granth and Guru Panth. And that's where Sikhs' allegiance always lies. And that's really something that the Indian state has not been able to handle, is still not able to handle. Um, and that doesn't mean that we're not good citizens. And that doesn't mean that we don't take part in the Indian social or political scene. In fact, Sikhs were very involved, and Sikhs really were proud to be Indian because we had worked so hard to free the country from Britain. So we could be citizens of India, we could be proud citizens of India, but at the same time, we are also part of a distinct community, a distinct Pant that is something different than India. And our allegiance will always be there first and then to India second. And that's something that Indian nationalists really can't understand, I think, even. I think they can't really wrap their head around that idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this wrapping their head around this idea um, is really helpful to think about for why, yeah, like the current context is the way that it is. I know we've talked about a lot of different reasons for the why, and as we shared, you can, yeah, check out the article on the website. But just to bring us all back onto the same page, maybe, yeah, share a quick summary um, of what the government's goals were in 1984, and yeah, which is related to the why 1984 occurred.
Yeah, so the government's goals was not to wipe out Sikhi, but it was to wipe out the political capacity of Sikhi. So that if something like emergency happened again, that there would not be this one community that was fighting back against the dictatorial policies of Indira Gandhi. It was to wipe out this idea that there's this one community that's demanding rights all the time and advocating for its political and social rights and organizing in these massive campaigns where like tens of thousands of people are getting arrested. In the Tarmi of the Morcha, the numbers are like really ridiculous. Within like a 2 year period, it's something like 300,000 people were arrested, which is just crazy numbers, you know? To imagine a political campaign where that many people were arrested in that short amount of time just demonstrates how united the Sikh community was, how wide scale these movements were, and how strong the commitment was to the movement amongst the Sikh population. And you can find these pictures online, really inspirational pictures from Punjabi Suba, for example, or from the 1920s, where you can see mothers with their children in their laps or holding their children, in front of a Akal Takht waiting to go out and give themselves up for arrest, where you have entire villages marching together, in the 1920s to free Gurdwaras from Mahant control. So this political capacity of Sikhs, that when we organize, when we come together, we become this unstoppable force that will just roll over the state. That's what they wanted to destroy. And that's why 84 happened. It was to destroy that political capacity of the Sikh population. And we'll get to whether they were successful or not next, but that was really the main goal. And everything that happened in 84, the horror of it, the scale of it, I think was for that goal, in my opinion. And it really brings things into context because, why would the Indian government attack Harmandir Sahib on one of the busiest days of the year, on Guru Arjan Sahib Shahidi? Well, if you really want to break a community spirit, you would attack its heart and you would do it on a day when there were lots of people there. If you really wanted to break a community, you would target its members across the country in really horrific violence. And this includes sexual violence and physical violence, which is what happened in November of 84, all across the subcontinent. Sikhs were targeted in almost every state of the country in just this really horrific violence, and violence that was really not spontaneous at all, but organized. And that's really important, that this was an organized campaign, so that the army attack in June of 84 on Harmandir Sahib and over 100 other gurdwaras around Punjab was not something that just sort of happened, but it was something that had been planned out for over 2 years by the Indian government since when the Tarmi of the Morcha had first started, the Morcha to get the Anandpur Sahib resolution implemented, that Indira Gandhi had built replicas of the Harimandar Sahib Complex and had been training, the Indian Army had been training commandos to attack the complex for like over 2 years before the attack happened. And November 84 also not spontaneous, very organized, very methodical, using voter lists, business tax lists, getting gasoline and keeping track of how much gasoline is being used, getting tires, like all this really sort of mundane aspects of this horrific violence that was organized by the Indian state. It's pretty horrific, and you see similar things happen during the Holocaust, for example, where a lot of what Nazi Germany is involved in is sort of the logistics of how do we kill this many people, right? And that's what happens in November of 84. Like, how do we go about really punishing Sikhs as a people en masse, so as to break their spirit and to really put them in their place. And that's what 84 was about. It was like putting Sikhs in their place. And um, it was sort of like what Israel's doing in Gaza right now. It's punishing an entire people for the actions of a few. It's punishing all Sikhs for the politically active Sikhs that are involved in the community, which again is a huge amount of Sikhs, in fact. But it's that type of organized violence against an entire community, that genocidal violence that we can call it. Yeah.
Yeah, really instilling like a fear into the community. Um,
Yes.
yeah, like a second guessing that always happens before someone, yeah, attempts to do anything or has any sort of thought that might not fall in line with what the central government thinks is correct. And I know we kind of already talked about it, um, about what the contemporary repercussions are and was the government successful. Yeah, but if you want to elaborate a little bit more, were the goals of 1984, the reasons for 1984, were they accomplished? And then what does that look like now? What are the contemporary day repercussions of that?
So in the immediate aftermath of 84, they were not successful. In fact, Sikhs organized an incredible number and did fight back quite literally against the Indian state. And the Khalsa movement at first was a really wide-scale, popularly supported movement. Um, but the violence that was carried out in the wake of 84 up to the early 90s uh, was in some ways successful, unfortunately. Not permanently, of course, but it did serve to do what the Indian government wanted, which was to quiet Sikhs and to make them less politically active. And throughout the 90s and early 2000s, we can see that Sikhs are not organizing in the way that they used to. They're not politically active like they used to be. They're not coming together to push back against central government policies. And that's not just because of 84, but that's because of the decade of disappearances, decade of sexual violence, decade of torture that followed 84. So all of that violence, all of those horrors that Punjab was subject to, that have been documented by human rights activists, people like Jaswant Singh Khalra or Insaf or Advocate Fulla, all that type of violence that happened against Sikhs really did. It seemed like it had worked to some degree, and Sikhs were it seemed like by the early 2000s, a community that was not going to be involved in wide-scale political protest again, or at least we didn't see any sort of semblance of that. And then the Beadbi issue happened. First, Radwana happened. I don't know if you remember when Radwana was first convicted. There was these sort of large-scale protests that happened around Punjab and around the world, this Pledge Orange campaign that had happened. And we saw the first hints of like, oh, there's still a lot of political capacity of the Sikhs of Punjab. They've been quiet for a long time, but it's still there. That spirit is still there, and it's just waiting for an outlet. And then we had the Beadbi issue happen, where Guru Granth Sahib Swarups were being desecrated, and the community started to organize in huge numbers. And you had the Sarbat Khalsa of 2017 happen then, and you saw a lot of that political capacity coming back. And then finally, you had the Kisan Morcha, where you saw really a return to the type of social and political activism the Sikhs used to have in the 60s and 70s and earlier, where the community really got behind the activists who were out on the front lines and really pushed through the change that they were looking for in this very politically conscious, um, politically intelligent way, of using nonviolent protest to get their goals across and get their message across. So the Kisan Morcha, I think a lot of us in the diaspora especially were really inspired by it. And people in Punjab were also inspired by it. And I think people around India also got a very um, different view of what Sikhs were about, that they had been fed after decades of propaganda about what Sikhs were about, you know? And it really demonstrated that Nyarapan, that uniqueness of the Khalsa Panth, that Sikh psyche was not erased. It's still there. It might have been suppressed for a while because of this level of horrific violence that had occurred. And we can't discount just how many young women were sexually assaulted by the Punjab police, how many young boys were tortured, how many family members were killed. Like, just the amount of violence is really incredible that the community suffered in the 80s and 90s. And that did make people afraid to be politically active for a while, and understandably so. And I remember going to Punjab in the 90s and people not wanting to talk about anything political, people not wanting to talk about Khalistan, people not wanting to talk about Sant Singh, people not wanting to talk about these issues because if you talked about these issues, you would be targeted by the government with horrific violence. And that's starting to change now in big numbers. And you can see that happening with the Kisan Morcha, where people were like, no, we are going to be politically active. We're going to get it done. We're going to be involved as a community. We're going to be active as a community. And we are going to sort of try to implement this vision of Ek Onkar that Guru Nanak Sahib Ji brought about in the world. And I think it's a really exciting time right now in Punjab, um, that we can see like the government's crackdown last year on Amritpal Singh was part of a larger campaign of going after Sikh activists in general. And Harinder Singh has spoken about this at large in a few different venues about just the level of government surveillance that is occurring in Punjab right now, just the level of government um, harassment, police harassment that's occurring with Sikh activists in Punjab right now. It's really something else. So the government is afraid of that spirit coming back, but I think that that spirit is impossible to get rid of. It's inherently what makes us sick, and it's something that's been there since the beginning, since Guru Nanak Sahib Ji started this path, and it's something that was solidified when the Khalsa was revealed by Guru Gobind Singh Sahib. It's not something that can be erased. And, you know, in the diaspora, we used to be like, man, Punjab is so useless. When I was younger, we used to say this. We used to be like, they don't talk about anything to do with Khalistan anymore. They don't talk about anything to do with political activism anymore. Punjabi Sikhs are just like not involved. But the truth is that Punjabi Sikhs are there when you need them to be, and they stand up for the community in the hardest times, in the most difficult circumstances, that they are there and they will stand up and they will be involved. And the Kisan Morcha demonstrated that in a really powerful way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we, as people in the diaspora, have this level of privilege where we are not in that physical space. Like, we're not
Very
in
much so. Yeah.
Punjab. There's no, there are repercussions that we face, but they're less tangible than the ones
Mhm.
that people in India face. So I think, yeah, that reluctance to be politically active or vocal, like, this really helps provide context for that. And it really, like, yeah, even it's helpful for other contexts where we feel like our people or like racialized people generally are not doing what we want them to do. Yeah, it yeah, maybe pushes us to think about why someone might not be like acting or behaving in a way that we think is like correct or right. There's kind of this huge history and, yeah, context that we're usually missing. Something also that I'm interested in is, as we are in the middle of the Indian election, as we approach like the American election in November, a Canadian election is looming. There are these narratives that get formed in the media and then in our homes, yeah, in various different spaces. And I think what we talked about in the Anandpur Sahib resolution portion of our chat about what the document actually says versus what government narratives um, claim that it says, those that distinction, it becomes hard because you're sometimes not looking at the primary documents yourself. You're kind of just listening to what other folks are saying. So yeah, as we kind of get fed these various narratives, how can people distinguish between the two? And then how can we, yeah, maybe give platform to the narratives of like the people's actual demands?
Yeah, that's a really powerful question. And I don't have the answer to that, to be honest, but it is something to really keep in mind. The fact that the government narratives are to suit a purpose, and especially when you have a country like India, which is going down this authoritarian route right now, this sort of right wing fascist route that a lot of unfortunately, countries seem to be going down around the world, in Hungary, and Russia, Turkey, and in America as well, and maybe Canada, unfortunately, as well. You see this turn to the right, this authoritarian turn that's happening around the world, and certain narratives are being pushed, certain ideas are being pushed, and the actual demands of the people are not being listened to. And what actually matters to people, the issues that people actually care about and are impacted by, are pushed to the side. And social media was supposed to be this thing that gave voice to people, but we've seen how it's actually become a tool of governments to push their narratives and to cause disharmony and confusion within countries in a way that we could maybe not have anticipated at first. So I'm not sure exactly what the solution is. The Indian election is particularly depressing, unfortunately, because um, Modi's and the BJP's grip on power seems stronger than ever. And the alternatives to right wing Hinduism aren't that great in India either. Um, and right wing Hinduism is part of this global nexus of right wing governments that really are anti press, anti scholarly, anti university, anti-minority, anti-intellectual freedom, um, and really stand counter to what Sikhs really believe in and what Sikhs have been advocating for generations. I think you see in the Punjab context, interesting things happen. Like in the last election, none of the political parties did well, and a whole new party came out of nowhere and did really well in the election, right? So people in Punjab are starting to become more politically active. They're starting to want to see change happen in a way um, that they used to expect, and they're starting to push for large scale social and political change happening again. Political parties in India haven't been able to really follow through on that message, and the central government is always stands counter to Sikhs' demands, unfortunately, right? In Canada and America, I don't I don't really have an answer to that, unfortunately. I mean, we have these incredible images coming out of American universities and Canadian universities of young people just so passionate about what's happening in Gaza and wanting so desperately for their government to not support an ongoing genocide. And it's really inspiring, but it's also a little haunting because it's not going to make a difference in terms of what the government's policies are tomorrow. And it will make a difference in 10, 15 years. I know that it will. And that there will be a change in the narrative as this generation grows older and the older generation passes away, that there will be major changes that happen as the younger generation comes into a political force. But unfortunately, the US isn't going to stop supporting Israel tomorrow, and neither is Canada, regardless of how powerful and amazing these protests are. And that is a little depressing, but I think sometimes activists or people who are involved in these sort of progressive movements, um, it's hard to think about the long term plan. Uh, and that's sometimes where we need to think. As a Sikh community as well, it's something that we've struggled with. I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but something like the Anandpur Sahib resolution, and I've been wanting to write about the Anandpur Sahib resolution this year. If I get a chance, I might put out an article on it, um, because all of the demands of the Anandpur Sahib resolution are still sitting there. None of them were fulfilled. Like 40 years later, nothing happened. We didn't get any of those things achieved. Like all of those social and political and economic demands that the Anandpur Sahib resolution had they were promised to us again and again by various central and state governments, and they never were put into practice. And so what are Sikhs' demands today? Do we go back 40 years? Do we have a new set of demands? Are the demands totally different because of what happened in 84? Those are some big, important questions. And those aren't questions that the community has yet answered. We are beginning to talk about it, but we haven't really had these conversations. And one of the reasons we haven't had these conversations is because of all that violence, right? We haven't had the opportunity or the space to have these conversations. But I think these conversations are going to start happening now where people are like, what do Sikhs want? How do we want to shape India? How do we want to shape Punjab? How do we want Punjab and India to look? And how are we going to make that happen? And I think the beginnings of that happen in the Kisan Morcha, and we'll start to hopefully see more of that as time goes on.
Yeah, I think you kind of picked up on that, like getting our narrative straight, getting our demands straight. Yeah, like moving towards a more cohesive narrative and more cohesive demands 40 years later. And I think, yeah, it has only been 40 years. So I think it seems like the arc is moving that way. Yeah, just to round out our conversation, last time we spoke about different terminologies that have been used to describe the various events of 1984. And as I was reading this article, I know it was written before that article, but you use words such as pogroms, such as the Battle of Amritsar. Today we've used the term genocide. So for folks maybe that haven't listened to that podcast, and are just interacting with this one, or they have listened to that, they're like wondering why we're using these terms. Yeah, I wanted to ask, why did you choose to use those terms? Yeah, for this article.
Yeah, I wanted to tackle that use of the terms and returning to the use of the word kalukara more familiarly and more commonly when we talk about 84. But I that didn't seem appropriate for the space of this article, so I used the terms that were more common in the community that I felt captured the idea. And even in our kalukara discussion, like I said, the fact that a genocide happened is something that legal scholars and human rights activists have proven has happened. So it's not that the word genocide is wrong, it's that it doesn't fully capture what the Sikhs experienced in 84. It doesn't fully capture all of the nuances of what we experienced. So there's nothing wrong with using terms like genocide or pogroms or the attack on Harimandar Sahib. It's just that to really capture the Sikh ideals and Sikh interpretation of those events, I think returning to Sikh terminology is most powerful. And that's why I advocate using the word Kalukara. But I don't think it's wrong to not use it, or it's something that we have to avoid like religiously or anything. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Santbir. This was a delightful conversation. I feel like I have so much that I've taken away that I can reflect on and I can apply to like other things that I'm thinking about. I know we mentioned it a couple times, but we did do another podcast where we talked about the different terminologies that have been used to describe the events of 1984. If people are interested in listening to that, I'll encourage you to either register or watch the recording for Santbir Singh's May 2024 online course titled Betrayals and Broken Promises. It delves a little bit deeper into what we talked about today. It's a 4-week course that provides an overview of Sikh-India relations all the way from the 1930s to the eve of June 1984 attack on the Harimandar Sahib Complex, exploring both the major events and the figures from a Sikh perspective and with a critical lens. Before I end off, Santbir, is there anything else that you wanted to add for
No,
folks listening?
thank you for having me and for the insightful questions. I really appreciate it. And just be on the lookout for more content around 84 that Sikri is putting out. We're really making an effort to commemorate the 40th anniversary with a variety of different podcasts, and we have more articles coming out. So be on the lookout for all the 84 content that Sikri is producing, that I hope will um, allow people to relate to 84 in a new way and try to put it into context in terms of Sikh history and Sikh tradition, um, and hopefully lead to some positive changes as well in the community.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today. And with that, we'll close out the podcast. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
You were listening to Sickcast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.